This committee will come to order. We could ask all the members to take their seats. Today we meet to discuss bringing more flexibility and more efficiency, and at the end of the day, more effectiveness to U.S. international food aid. It was 60 years ago, during the Eisenhower administration, that the U.S. government set up a system to buy surplus food and then to donate it overseas. In an effort to bolster domestic farmers and to assist shippers, this was mandated to be U.S. grown and U.S. shipped. And decades ago, that may have made some sense. But farm markets have changed substantially since the policy was set in the Eisenhower administration. Food prices and U.S. agricultural exports have reached historic highs. In fact, the past 4 years have been the strongest in history for agricultural exports. Food aid now accounts for less than 0.5% of net farm income, and this farm subsidy can no longer be defended. Another impediment to an effective, efficient program is the requirement that 50% of U.S. food aid be shipped on U.S. flagged vessels. Decades ago, this cargo preference was seen as a way to ensure a reserve of ships and crew for the U.S. Navy in times of war. But by restricting competition to the few U.S. flagged ships still sailing, the majority of which do not meet the Maritime Administration's age-based criterion, cargo preference adds $140 million in transportation costs each year, and delivery times are lengthened by many, many months, which in times of emergency, in times of famine, doesn't make a lot of sense. On average, only about 2 to 4 U.S. flag carriers place bids per food shipment, making the system prone to manipulation. Due to a complex set of holding companies, most of these American vessels are, in fact, foreign-owned. They are foreign-owned. As one witness will testify today, in the past decade, 50% of the food aid budget has been eaten up by transportation costs. 50% of the food aid budget eaten up by transportation costs. Today, the U.S. flagged requirement simply serves the interests of a handful of companies. In fact, the Pentagon has determined that an easing of cargo preference requirements would have, in their view, no tangible effect upon U.S. maritime security. Perhaps the worst abuse of the U.S. food aid program is monetization, the process by which Washington supplies American commodities to private groups to then be sold overseas. The Government Accountability Office called monetization inherently inefficient and found that it resulted in a net loss of $219 million over 3 years. Worse, dumping commodities often destroys local markets, putting local farmers out of business, while increasing the dependency on food aid that we'd like to see end. That's why you've seen some countries like Rwanda shut down this easily abused practice. Given our fiscal constraints, we must be prepared to do more with less. We must replace entitlements for a few with tools that would provide more flexibility, more efficiency, more effectiveness, and we can do this in a bipartisan way. I'm encouraged that President Obama has proposed to loosen the restrictions on U.S.-bought commodities so that more food can be brought closer to a crisis. With the Farm Bill scheduled for floor consideration this month, members will have a chance to advance these common-sense reforms. In recent years, there's been a lot of focus in Washington on foreign assistance reform. In my eyes, this food aid reform proposal is an acid test. If Congress can't agree to help more people in less time and at less cost, then there is little hope for broader foreign aid reform. And I hope we can do better than that. But I'll now turn to our ranking member, Mr. Engel from New York, for his opening remarks.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for holding this very timely hearing and for your leadership in tackling the issue of food aid reform. We have been working together on this, and we see these things in exactly the same way, and I think that's very, very important. Administrator Natsios, welcome. Secretary Glickman, it's great to have you back where you belong. For many years, you served in this body as a member of the House and very distinguished in a very distinguished way, and then as Agriculture Secretary, of course, and we're all aware of the good work that you've done through the years, and so welcome to you as well. Since 1954, the Food for Peace program has fed more than 1 billion people around the world and saved countless lives. This reflects the compassion and generosity of the American people, and it's something that we should all be proud of. However, despite its great success, Food for Peace is now showing its age and is in urgent need of reform. One of the key problems with the current system is that it takes too long to deliver U.S.-grown food aid, an average of 130 days. That's a long time. By purchasing food in the recipient country or region, we can cut that time in half, and in the process, get food to starving people before it's too late. Hunger pangs shouldn't be subject to shipping schedules. In addition, it's very expensive to transport the food from the U.S. heartland to recipient countries. In fact, shipping, transportation, and handling costs account for approximately half of the food aid budget. We can save hundreds of millions of taxpayer dollars by purchasing food aid closer to the destination countries. And thirdly, the current system sometimes harms agricultural markets in the countries we're trying to help. This is the result of a somewhat bizarre process called monetization, in which non-governmental organizations sell U.S. commodities overseas in order to fund other development projects. Doesn't make any sense to me. In my travels to Haiti, I've seen firsthand how the sale of American rice under this well-intentioned program has driven local rice farmers out of business, thus making it harder for Haitians to feed themselves. Monetization is also exceedingly wasteful. According to the GAO, at least 25 cents of every dollar is lost during this process. So I commend the President, I commend the administration for its food aid reform proposal, and I'm pleased to support it, along with Chairman Royce, whom I also commend. In this time of increasing political polarization, I think it's a testament to the strength of good ideas and common sense that this plan has garnered bipartisan support on Capitol Hill, and from groups as disparate as the Heritage Foundation and Oxfam. And in this committee particularly, the Chairman and I have worked together to promote bipartisanship, and this is another example of bipartisanship, and it's all good. Sometimes it seems that we lose sight of why we have a food aid program in the first place. It isn't to subsidize growers, shippers, or NGOs. It's to prevent men, women, and children in the developing world from starving to death. For those who worry about the impact of this proposal on the farm community, there's a reason why Cargill, the National Farmers Union, and other ag interests have expressed support for additional flexibility in our food aid programs. Mr. Chairman, the easy thing is to do nothing on the issue of food aid reform, but the right thing to do is to enact sensible reforms that save taxpayer money and, most importantly, save lives. I look forward to working with you to get some of these reforms implemented, and I look forward to hearing from our distinguished witnesses. I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Engel. We have two distinguished witnesses here today. Mr. Natsios. Well, we were, in the interest of time, we were going to move forward at this point, and perhaps during your 5 minutes you could get that 1 minute statement in, if that's all right, Mr. Sherman. Mr. Natsios is an executive professor at the School of Government and Public Service at Texas A&M University. For 6 years, he served as administrator of U.S. Agency for International Development. He served as U.S. Special Envoy to Sudan and as Vice President of World Vision. Secretary Glickman is the Executive Director of the Aspen Institute, the congressional program there, and he served as the U.S. Secretary of Agriculture for 6 years, and before his appointment as Secretary of Agriculture, he served for 18 years in the U.S. House of Representatives, representing the 4th Congressional District of Kansas. So we welcome you both. And without objection, the witnesses' full prepared statements will be made part of the record. Members have 5 days to submit statements and questions for the record, and I'd ask if you could summarize your statements. Mr. Natsios, we'll begin with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for the opportunity to talk about an issue close to my heart. About 10 years ago, when I was aid administrator, we proposed a similar reform, didn't go quite as far because we wanted to just try it out, that 25% of Title II of the Food for Peace Act could be used at the discretion of the Administrator of Aid and the Director of Food for Peace Office and Aid for local purchase. I presented the proposal to the Coalition of Food Aid, and I was astonished at the hostility of the reaction. When interest groups are assembled around a particular law, they can get quite aggressive. So this is not a partisan issue. This was proposed by President Bush. It's been proposed by President Obama, and they don't exactly agree with each other on a lot of issues. So given the comprehensiveness of the coalition behind this, Oxfam, the Heritage Foundation, there are conservatives behind it, liberals behind it. Mr. Chairman, you've shown great leadership on this issue yourself. This is the time to approve these reforms. There are 4 arguments for this. I'll make them very quickly and then talk about 3 cautions on this. The first is it saves time. When I was in charge of the Somalia response during the Somalia famine of 1991-92, in which 250,000 people died, I literally watched children die while we waited for food to arrive. It took 2 to 3 months. That is the thing that shocked me into realizing we needed changes to the system, but it wasn't my place at that point to propose the changes. Once I became aid administrator, it was a different story. So there's a time factor. You have to order the food in the Midwest. It gets put on ships. It's shipped down the Mississippi River usually, depending on where it comes from in the U.S. It can go 7,000 miles to the other side of the world. It is offloaded, put onto trucks, and then moved to the famine or the emergency. Frequently, it's through a war zone. We've gone through several war zones, in some cases, to get the food to where it belongs. If the food is bought locally in a local market, you can avoid a 7,000-mile supply chain. Amartya Sen, who won the Nobel Prize for Economics, he's a friend of mine, a professor at Harvard, and he wrote the seminal work on famine economics, and he argues that that supply chain makes it dysfunctional to use food aid under these circumstances when there's an emergency that's right in front of us where we have to respond very quickly. People do not wait for food aid and can suspend their nutritional requirements. They simply die. And I've watched too many people die in these emergencies over the last 23 years while I've been involved in humanitarian work. Secondly, it saves money. The cargo preference law, with 1 or 2 exceptions over the last 20 years, has required us to spend much more money to ship than would have been if we had gone to a free and open market. I am a free trader, and I think if we open this up to competition internationally, we would not have to spend this much on shipping. So there's a cost savings involved here. In addition, with respect to monetization, the 2 ranking members have mentioned the arguments. I'm not going to repeat them, but I ran these programs when I was at World Vision, so I know very much the limitations. I used to sit and say, why are we doing this? This doesn't make sense. The reason NGOs do it, it's a source of revenue to run programs. And I understand people would say, well, we have to run the programs, Andrew. I said, yes, but we're damaging local markets, and this is not efficient. We've just spent half the budget getting the food to where it's going, and then we only get back a portion of the value of the commodity when it's auctioned off in local markets. So monetization doesn't make sense from a financial standpoint, and programmatically and economically doesn't make sense. I think given the savings, we can in fact feed more people. And finally, we can encourage local agriculture. The World Food Program, in order to provide food aid to the people in southern Sudan during the Civil War, made arrangements with farmers in northern Uganda over many years to produce the food locally, grow the food locally, and that stimulated agricultural development, it stimulated markets, it strengthened markets, it put more money in poor people's pockets, and it was much faster and more efficient. We know it works because we've already tried it. This is not experimental. The three things I would mention is that we should take out the requirements, but don't put new requirements in. That is to say, there is one instance where we do want to be able to auction food off in local markets. One of the causes of famines is spikes in food prices, massive price increases over a short period of time. We have 3 or 4 times in the last 20 years intervened in markets to auction food off to stabilize prices. When prices go up 700 to 1,000% in 3 months, if that happened in the United States, we'd have hungry people. In fact, some people might even die here if that happened. It happens regularly in famines. We want the flexibility to be able to do that. And so the decision as to whether or not to use market intervention should be left with the Director of Food for Peace at the lowest level and not put into law to protect interest groups in the United States. So I think, frankly, if we do these things, we do it right, we will strengthen the Food for Peace program. It is a wonderful program. It's a jewel in the United States. We have saved millions of people's lives. The question is, can we improve the system? And the answer is, yes, we can. These reforms do that. I support them. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Natsios. Mr. Glickman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Engel, members. It's a delight to be here. I look up on the walls. I see Ben Gilman, Henry Hyde, Dante Facel, Tom Lantos, and Clem Zablocki. Without dating myself, I served with all these people. So just a great joy to be here at this committee room. First of all, it's an honor to be here with Andrew Natsios, who very few people can claim the fact that they've saved hundreds of thousands of lives, and he and his agency have done that. So, and the Bush administration, I must commend for their great efforts in these areas, particularly in global AIDS, health, TB, and the food part of it has been remarkable. It's bipartisan. It's one of the things that makes America unique and great, and it's something that we should continue to reinforce. My statement talks about the great humanitarian needs which are increasing. We see that happening in the Middle East right now. The commitment is bipartisan, which we see from the chairman's own bill that he's talked about with Mr. Engel, Congresswoman Bass, and others. And we see a consensus growing on issues that Andrew talked about, which need for greater flexibility, using cash transfers and food vouchers where appropriate, but supplying commodities in those cases where it's appropriate, not a one-size-fits-all situation. A greater efficiency, we talked about the losses that are in the current way we do business, and greater impact is achieved by having this more flexibility. But I thought I would talk a little bit about the agriculture side of this picture because of the impact on American farmers and ranchers and what this all means. And as a former USDA secretary, it's critical to underscore the benefits of food aid reform to U.S. agriculture. So we started this program in part because of big surpluses and the American moral desire to help the rest of the world, and those two facts worked together. More than 60 years later, U.S. agriculture productivity remains high. In 2012, agriculture was one of 4 categories with a U.S. trade surplus. Changes in U.S. agricultural policy and rising consumer demand outside of our country, where 95% of the people live, ensure that commodities not needed for American consumption now flow quickly into thriving global markets. That means that food aid procurements have become an increasingly smaller proportion of U.S. overall commercial agriculture sales. From 2002 to 2011, the Food for Peace program procured less than 1% of the total food that was exported from the United States. The volume of food assistance provided by the U.S. has been steadily declining over time due to higher food prices and overall appropriations for the program. From 2002 to 2011, the purchases of U.S. food aid by U.S. government declined from 5 million to 1.8 million metric tons. Given these changes, the future interests of U.S. agriculture are less in the provision of U.S. food aid and to a greater extent in the development of stable, thriving economies that can create new markets for American business and new consumers for American products and developing stronger economies and bringing these countries out of poverty. The opportunities for American farmers for overseas are no longer on our soil, but dependent on purchases and trade with countries overseas. Developing countries accounted for 97% of global population growth in 2012, and it is anticipated that nearly all future population growth will be in the world's less developed economies. So it is firmly in the interest of American farmers to support greater efficiencies and flexibility within our food aid system so that we can provide more food to more people and support the local and regional agricultural development systems of future trading partners. This would promote the well-being and health of populations and potential future consumers, opening up new trade and investment opportunities for U.S. agribusiness. As the Chairman mentioned, both the National Farmers Union and Cargill recently expressed support for food aid efforts. Cargill said it is time that we reassess the current program to make certain it is efficient and effective in meeting the needs and flexibility, and that we can move people on the brink of starvation to the brink of development. For example, South Korea, once a huge recipient of U.S. food aid, is now America's 6th largest trading partner, and in 2011 imported more than $4 billion worth of agriculture commodities from the United States. This can happen to the developing world in Africa, in South Asia, and Latin America, not overnight, and we realize that many of these countries, because of humanitarian desires and needs, will still need some food aid. There's no question about it. But we need to transition ourselves to building their economies so that they can buy more from us. In conclusion, the world has long possessed the collective resources and knowledge to end global hunger. What has often been lacking is the political will and sustained leadership at the highest levels of government. I think we now have broad agreement on what needs to be done to improve our food aid programs, and we must seize the opportunity. With your leadership, with the leadership of the Obama administration, and the historic leadership of the Bush administration, I'm confident that we can modernize these programs, make them much more flexible to help the world, to help the humanitarian needs of people overseas, and to help America's farmers and ranchers as well. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
We go to Mr. Natsios for a question about emergency aid to Syria that might make my point and your point here. The majority of food aid we've been discussing is through the Department of Agriculture's Food for Peace. Now, there is a small, separate emergency food security program that USAID set up, all right? This emergency program allows for cash resources to be used for local and regional purchases of food and food vouchers. And as I understand it, if not for the flexibility of that program, USAID would not have been able to launch a rapid food response to the Syrian crisis, and here's why. Because it's a very stark contrast. The first shipment, U.S. food shipment, just arrived in the region in Syria. Just arrived 2 weeks ago. That's 2 years after the crisis began. But even with this shipment, it is now the case that trucking it in to the population in need, because of the difficulties of doing that, it's not conceivable to move major portions of food by truck into those regions on a daily basis, because there's a daily assault by the Syrian military units. So that isn't likely to happen. So this old structure, frankly, comes 2 years late, and now the food aid is in country, but how do you get it to the region most in need, to those most in need? So with a more flexible program, it seems to me, we've been able to respond quickly, we've been able to maintain access and help keep local markets running and reduce the probability of aid dependency over the long term. But I'd like to just ask you for your thoughts on that, Mr. Natsios.
Well, this goes back, Mr. Chairman, to this comment of Amartya Sen that when you have a 7,000-mile supply chain, a lot of things can happen along the way. It's not just in the country. We had pirates in Somalia steal or take 2 ships. They pirated 2 ships of food aid from the World Food Program over a number of years, and we never saw another shipment of food sank in a storm. The warehouses down in Galveston, we were crossing our fingers when the Hurricane Katrina, it barely missed those warehouses. We would have had people die because those warehouses had been destroyed. They weren't, but it was very close. So the longer the supply chain, the more bad things can happen. but particularly the most serious problem we face is in civil wars where there's food insecurity. And most of the food now, 82% of all food from Food for Peace is now going to emergencies, which is usually civil wars and famines. Most famines are also an offshoot of civil wars. The two things are a toxic mix with each other. And what usually happens is one side sees the food coming in because it's very visible. You can't hide 100,000 tons of food. You can't ship it electronically through a banking system, which you can do with cash, to an NGO doing local vouchers, for example. It's a giant red flag. And if a particular side in a civil war wants to starve their opponents to death, the way you do is you blow up the food shipments. And this is not new. The Sudanese government starved hundreds of thousands of Southerners to death during the Sudanese Civil War, which killed 4 million people over 50 years. There were 2 civil wars, actually. And a lot of those people died of starvation because the government used the very long supply chain, the logistical system to get food in, to simply stop the shipments. Mengistu did the same thing, the Marxist dictator of Ethiopia, in 1990 and 91, and he was blowing up our shipments of food convoys going into Ethiopia because he was trying to starve the Tigrayans and the Eritreans to death during a famine. And the way we, in fact, got around that is I, with congressional approval, used a couple of $1 million in the OFDA budget, which is a separate emergency account. It's not supposed to be used for food purchase. Not by law. By law, we could do it, but the Congress said that's for health and water and sanitation and shelter. The Food for Peace budget's for food. But in this particular case, they let us do it. We bought 20,000 tons of sorghum in a surplus area that Mengistu did not control. We moved it into the famine area. We saved tens of thousands of people's lives by doing that. That's where I got convinced in that 1990 famine that this is the best way to approach this. And you, Mr. Chairman, have just pointed out not a 20-year-old example, but a current example of exactly the same thing happening in Syria.
And I think now we need to go to the cargo preference, the impact on competition there. So I'm going to ask you a couple of questions because USAID reports that on average only 2 to 4 companies respond to solicitations to ship food aid to begin with. How does the lack of competition among shippers impact cost, and how does it impact accountability? I'm going to ask you those questions, and then I'd also, during your tenure at USAID, we began to become involved in a number of major conflicts. So I'm going to ask you that if during your tenures were any private U.S.-flagged commercial vessels called upon to protect U.S. maritime security during that period of time, and to your knowledge, since the Cargo Preference Act was enacted back in 1954, have any private U.S.-flagged commercial vessels ever been called upon to protect U.S. maritime security? And I'll just finish with this last question. Should U.S.-flagged vessels that fail to meet the eligibility criterion for the Maritime Security Program continue to be eligible for cargo preference?
Well, I don't want to start casting aspersions on different industries, Mr. Chairman, but I am not a supporter of the cargo preference law, particularly with respect to AID. It's outlived its usefulness. The argument during the Cold War was that we needed our merchant marine because there was an existential threat to the survival of the United States during World War II and then during the Cold War, and it was real. And we needed to protect our domination of the world sea lanes. That is no longer the case. The threats to the United States are not of the same character. We're not facing a superpower that's threatening whole regions of the world. The threat now is completely different. Al-Qaeda is not threatening the sea lanes of the world. They're threatening terrorist acts in particular countries, but they're not the same kind of threat. And so the general justification for the cargo preference law, in my view, doesn't exist anymore. And I think your questions answer themselves, Mr. Chairman. There's no justification for doing this, particularly when there's been such a huge decline in the amount of tonnage we've been able to buy, because there's been a big increase in food prices. And there's an argument from some reputable economists that we're not going to go back to the era of cheap food anymore. There's been a huge decline in the volume of food aid we've been able to deliver. And the principal source of most food aid in the international system is the U.S. government. It's not other countries. We are the greatest agricultural power in the world. I mean, our farmers are the best in the world and the most efficient and highest quality. But the reality is prices are going up, and so we're able to buy less food. We need the reforms now in order to buy more food with a fixed budget, given the fiscal constraints the federal government is facing.
Thank you, Mr. Natsios. We'll go to Mr. Engel.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Natsios, we often hear from opponents of food aid reform that the current system doesn't need to be changed, that there's plenty of flexibility with the positioning, especially with the positioning of food stocks and limited cargo preference waivers, that we have enough flexibility now. In your experience as USAID administrator, do you believe that's the case?
No, I do not believe it. If I did, I wouldn't have come all the way from Texas to testify. I wouldn't have got President Bush to offer these reforms, which, by the way, he enthusiastically embraced when we explained them to him. And he's been an advocate even after he left office of these reforms. So I think the notion that the current system works well, the facts don't support that. And I might add, it's not from one source that it is making this argument. The General Accounting Office has done a whole series of papers over 2 decades. Professor Chris Barrett, a colleague of mine at Cornell University, wrote a book some years ago about this. AID's internal studies show these reforms are necessary. OMB research shows it. The Center for Global Development has done an excellent brief on this paper, on this reform, and they've endorsed it. I mean, you can go through a whole series of sources all arguing reform is necessary. I am not aware of one single source other than special interest groups who are affected financially by these reforms, who think the current system works well and works to our advantage.
Can you share with us an example of how the current food aid authorities hindered your ability to get food into emergency relief situations in a timely manner?
Yes. In Somalia, we were caught because the famine was connected to a civil war. The UN had withdrawn, the International Committee of the Red Cross had withdrawn, and we had shut down the aid mission. There was literally no one there, this was 1991, to see what was going on until it was too late. When I realized that there was actually I went myself because I heard these reports that were trickling out. And when I saw, I was shocked how bad things were. It took 3 months to ship the stuff just to port, and because there was chaos in the country, it took even more months to get it to the epicenter of the famine. So that specific instance was very clear because I watched it myself on the ground. The second instance is the Ethiopian famine that I mentioned earlier. It didn't become a famine because we intervened in 1990, because we used a provision of OFDA's very limited budget, and we couldn't, what we did was we took money out of the health budget and the water budget, which kills people if you don't spend enough on it, to purchase food in one part of Ethiopia and move it to another. Had we had more money and more flexibility in the Food for Peace account, we could have done that on a much larger scale. More recently, the Somali famine of 2 years ago, the same thing happened. Al-Qaeda did not want the United States government providing food aid, and I'll tell you why. When we responded to the Aceh tsunami, Al-Qaeda's poll ratings collapsed. I don't know if you know this, but they had a 63% approval rating, bin Laden in Indonesia, before the Aceh tsunami, which took place, I think, in December of 2004, as I recall. No, yes, 2004, December of 2004. After the U.S. government's response, which is AID and the U.S. military, his poll ratings went down to 26%, and our poll ratings, which had been at 23%, went up to 57%. So we had a massive spike in our popularity and a massive decline in his popularity because of our responses. Now, I'm not suggesting we just save people's lives to get more public support, but it has a consequence when we do it. A third example would be the Syrian example that was just mentioned by the chairman. The Syrian government is trying to starve the opposition into surrender. The Sudanese government did the same thing in southern Sudan over 22 years of civil war. What did WFP do with European money, not American money, because we couldn't use our food aid budget for this purpose, is they went to northern Uganda to farmers and said, grow the food locally, we'll ship it in. It's much faster, and the Sudanese government can't stop it through Port Sudan. And that's what they did. The Europeans went, and the Canadians, a big producer of food, went to 100% local purchase long time ago. We are the last remaining outliers in this because of interest group opposition.
Thank you. I'd like to just quickly ask Mr. Glickman a question. You served as Agriculture Secretary, and with distinction, I might add. And you mentioned in your opening testimony something that surprised me initially, is that the agriculture community is not opposed to this reform plan resolutely. National Farmers Union, as you mentioned, Cargill, and others who are supportive of some of the President's proposal calling for more flexibility. If you didn't know that, you would think it would be counterproductive at first blush. So why is that?
Well, first of all, I think the agriculture community is probably split on this subject, being honest with you. And I think a lot of people are either fearful of what might happen if we don't have a statutory requirement that the overwhelming majority of the food aid that's sent is in commodities, because I think they fear that maybe with budget issues or other things it won't get the same priority here in the Congress or the administration. But I think there's the growing recognition that we need a heck of a lot more flexibility. It's not all or nothing. And I think what the chairman's proposing and what the administration is proposing is just upping the amount of cash.
Do you think this would have much of an impact on American farm income?
No. In fact, my judgment is over the long term, this is a big plus for American agriculture, because it will create the opportunity for countries to become more self-sufficient and buy more things from us. And there are examples around the world in Southeast Asia, and I mentioned Korea and others. It's tough in sub-Saharan Africa and other places to do this in the short term, but they desperately need us to help them become more food self-sufficient. If I may just say that I owe a lot of my own knowledge of this to Catherine Bertini, who was head of the World Food Program for 10 years. And she and I co-chaired an effort for the Chicago Council on Global Affairs called Advancing Global Food Security, which I would encourage that the committee could be part of the record or whatever you'd want to do. And it goes into great detail about what countries can do for themselves. And we need a combination of cash and commodities with much greater flexibility. And I think when the agriculture community realizes that, I think you're going to see more support than there has been in the past. But yes, there is clearly some support.
Thank you, Mr. Glickman. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Engel. We go now to the Chairman of the Subcommittee on Africa, Global Health, Human Rights, and International Organizations, Mr. Smith.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for calling this very important hearing. Welcome to our two very distinguished witnesses who have done so much for so long to save lives. And having worked with Mr. Natsios for so long when he was doing emergency help for refugees and others, particularly getting food aid out. And I remember those Mengistu years. They were awful when he used food as a weapon. I visited Banda Aceh after it was devastated by the 2004 tsunami, and you, Mr. Natsios, pointed out that the Indonesian foreign minister asked us not to send rice. We did it anyway. And then you said the rice farmers were almost completely ruined. I would hope that you could elaborate on that, because I think that's a very poignant story and needs to be elaborated on. Secondly, you've testified that as many as 4 million people could receive food aid, and you mentioned that Elliott and McKitterick said that as many as 10 million could be reached if we went with local purchase. That's a big disparity, but it also is all in one direction. Maybe you might want to touch on that further. And the response time issue, which you strongly highlighted, USDA 130 days to purchase, to actual delivery as compared with 56 days for local purchase, a whopping 74-day time when people could be literally starving. I wonder if you could perhaps elaborate on that a little bit as well. And finally, you mentioned in your testimony with regards to the Food for Peace program, when you break out the 49% savings, you have a number of variables in there. 17%, 17.6% for ocean freight. Inland freight is 7.5% of the additional costs. Internal transport, storage, and handling is 24.3%. And my question is, local purchase, if you could define that more clearly for the committee, because obviously in some war-ravaged and famine-ravaged areas, local purchase could be 2 countries away or several countries away. Would some of that inland cost also be, just so we have a real sense of accuracy about what the true savings are. There's no doubt that the savings are enormous, and the potential for lives saved is in similar fashion enormous, but just so we have clarity on that.
Just to answer your last question first, the data, which I have in a footnote, in my testimony, is aggregated over many years. It's not for one specific emergency. It varies very substantially. The food aid, for example, that went to Haiti, the costs are much lower. Why? Because Haiti's not too far from our coast. But the majority of food aid right now in that we ship from the United States, not the majority, the overwhelming majority, 81%, goes to Africa.
Right.
And it goes to emergencies, not to stable areas where no one's shooting at you. When they shoot at you, the costs go up because you have to hire guards to protect the shipments from being looted, for example. Some of this cost is security, in fact, guards to prevent the warehouses from being looted in a civil war. So it depends on the area. The percentages will vary very substantially, but we know historically over the last 5 or 10 years where most of this aid has been going, and has been going to sub-Saharan Africa. Now, that's shifted because of what's happening in Libya now, okay? So
if I just be clear, the
yes.
internal transport, storage, and handling, that cost is evaded when local purchase is used, or is it evaded in some instances?
If we're shipping to Haiti, the cost is not going to be, the savings is not going to be as great, anywhere near as great. But that's not where most of the food is going. As I said, 80% is going to Africa. That's a much further distance away. If the emergencies, like Liberia, for example, is right on the coast and the food is going not too far inland, the savings will be less. If it goes to South Sudan or Ethiopia doesn't have its own port, for example. Or when we had the Rwandan genocide going on, you have a huge number of miles for the shipments of food to go. The food that went to Darfur, we're still feeding people in those camps. It's very expensive to get food to Darfur. You have to go 900 kilometers from the port to Darfur to get the food into those camps.
And where would the local procurement be for Darfur?
Darfur, what I would do if I had the authority, I would do it in northern Uganda or northern part.
So there would be some shipping costs, but it would be far less.
It would be far less, exactly.
Now, in terms of Bonaccia, my time's almost out. You mentioned that the rice farmers were devastated.
Well, they had a choice.
Okay.
It wasn't the rice farmers, it was the rice farmers in Haiti that were devastated, not in Indonesia.
It wasn't clear from your testimony.
Right. In both cases, the foreign ministry asked us not to ship the food, and we said, we can not ship it, but we cannot buy the food locally because we're not allowed to do that under the law. And they said, oh, no, we have to have the food. We would prefer you to buy it locally. I said, so would we. But if we can't, we'll stop the shipment if you want. And they said, no, we need the food. So we shipped it. It devastated the Haiti rice farmers after the earthquake, which took place a couple years ago. And Aceh, Indonesia, is a much larger market, so we did not destroy markets because the country's so large. But it damaged markets, and that's why, if we had a choice, we should have bought the food in Indonesia, which has functioning agricultural markets.
Well, as I saw and you saw and everyone else saw, the tsunami only went in 200, 300, 400 yards, and after that, it was totally untouched.
Exactly.
Well, not out of time. On the response time, 130 days versus 56, 74 days of huge improvement. That is a tremendous savings of time, which means life. Thank you for emphasizing that in your testimony.
Yes.
Mr. Sherman of California.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So far, every minute in this room has been spent advocating food aid reform. If every minute had been spent up until now trashing food aid reform, I would spend my 5 minutes promoting it. But that's not the case. There are strong arguments for food aid reform. They were summarized well in the opening statements of the chairman and the ranking member. I believe one of the witnesses has testified that all of the questioning of reform has come from special interests. So this will be a new experience for you, since we'll spend a few minutes. As to me being a special interest, I have 0 farms in my district. I have 0 ports in my district. I have 0 ships in my district. And my state pretty much doesn't grow anything you'd want to ship in food aid, because oranges are really not part of our disaster relief program. But the fact is that there are some arguments on the other side. The one place, though, where there are no arguments is you can't let people starve in a disaster because of an inflexible statute. But much of our food aid could continue to be American-produced without that eventuality happening. Now, we're told that we have the lion's share of agricultural production, therefore we provide the lion's share of food aid. Well, if food aid is no longer food aid is just money to spend in northern Uganda, yen can be spent there as well as dollars, euros are accepted with the same glee, and the real pressure should be, and is not really put by the United States on our European and Japanese friends, to provide their share of food aid now that food aid is money to be spent locally. As to shipping, I think it would be wrong to blame the 2-year delay in sending food to Syria on American ships. Most of that delay is not the speed of the ships. The current system of preferences may be very impaired, may be close to useless, but that doesn't mean our choice is abolish it or preserve it. We ought to give a preference only to U.S.-owned, U.S.-crewed ships that are not only available to the military, and that may not be important to the military, but one thing we haven't talked about here is our trade deficit, our need for U.S. jobs. You know, every part of the government could save money if we didn't make them buy American. Then we'd have a lot fewer jobs. Now, I'm reluctant to give the State Department flexibility in any issue involving U.S. jobs and our trade deficit, because they're almost hostile to even talking about the trade deficit. Last time I quizzed them, they said there's no relationship between the trade deficit and U.S. jobs. And so we need statutory formulas so that state will give due credit to U.S. jobs in shipping and agriculture. Otherwise, they'll just give it lip service and say, well, they looked at it, and then they hired the cheapest ship with 0 U.S. sailors aboard. I think that given the size of the U.S. trade deficit, we should never have a discussion of international financial transactions that doesn't include looking at the trade deficit. Let's see. We also have to take a look at the possible negative effect on the local market. If you go into northern Uganda, you don't automatically create new food. You're buying food that was going to be sold in Kampala, and now you're buying it and sending it into Sudan. Maybe that's a good thing long term because it gives farmers the money to improve their farms, or maybe it causes a famine or at least higher prices in urban Uganda. So we need to look at both the positive and negative effects on local markets. Finally, I do have a question in here somewhere. Our Indonesian experience demonstrated that where there's American food going to disaster victims, and everybody knows it's American food, and it is grown in America, it's got an American flag on the bag, that we get a response that's helpful. Are we going to see a flag on a bag if the food inside isn't grown in America? And are we going to see those who carry out the food aid find it even more convenient to obscure the fact that they have anything to do with the United States because they're more popular with those they have to work with and more immune from terrorist attack if they say all this stuff is coming from Europeans and Canadians? Mr. Glickman.
Okay, I'll start this because one is, under the President's proposal, 55% of the food aid that would be going would be required to be in the form of commodities. And that's the first year. They had no language on what future years would be. I think they probably should have put in some language on that. But and then under the Chairman's issue, he's not changing the percentage in a revolutionary way. So all we're trying to do is to provide more flexibility so that local food purchases...
But my question was, what do we lose in Indonesia if the food isn't from the United States?
I can't answer that. The only thing I can tell you is that when I was Secretary, I was very much involved in both ways to both trade out and give out our excess and surplus commodities because we were growing way more than we could consume in this country. Those days are over. And the supply-demand lines in the future will not be anywhere like they were in the past. So given that, I do agree with you that to the extent possible, we need to make sure we use all relevant means to let folks know that the aid is coming from America. And my judgment is the overwhelming percentage of the aid is still going to be in the form of commodities because of humanitarian needs that both Mr. Natsios and the Chairman have talked about. But at the same time, commodities are not suitable for everybody, every place, and we should not be statutorily prevented from offering other ways of providing assistance. So I just think that this is a much more modern way to get our food and our aid into these desperate places that need it. That's my judgment.
Thank you. My time has expired.
Could I just add something with respect to Indonesia and the branding campaign? I put in place, when I was aid administrator, the branding campaign that says U.S. aid from the American people. So I'm very familiar with it, very proud of it. But no one would argue that we should only provide aid if we get credit for it, because a lot of the aid we provide makes a difference between whether people live or die. You don't kill children in order to get better public diplomacy. In fact, if people actually knew the reality, they might say, wait a second, you denied us aid in order to get credit for it? It doesn't make any sense. And I know, Mr. Congressman, that's not what you're suggesting, but we want to understand the purpose of this program by statute is to provide humanitarian assistance. Public diplomacy is an offshoot of it, and a good offshoot.
When we see al-Qaeda-affiliated quote humanitarian organizations distributing aid that's actually paid for by the American people because they get their hands on the bag, we've got a big problem for the American people. My time has expired.
Well, let me just answer that. The increase in our poll ratings in Indonesia, the dramatic improvement, and al-Qaeda's collapse in the poll ratings took place before one bag of any U.S. food arrived. It took place over a 3-month period, and that's how long it took to ship the food from the United States. So the data that I quoted to you, which is widely publicized, but it's in several reports that this happened, took place before any food aid arrived. And principally, as the Chairman pointed out, I guess it was Congressman Smith pointed out, this was not principally a food emergency because the Aceh tsunami came in a few hundred feet, killed a lot of people, and then it departed. But it didn't destroy the agricultural system of Indonesia. And so it wasn't principally a food emergency. We did send some food in. But what we do is, in the branding campaign, every NGO, every contractor, every partner of the U.S. has to put a big brand on the thing, U.S. aid from the American people, red, white, and blue. And it's required. And we did this deliberately, and we also run some public service announcements on the media to show what we're doing. So there are ways, without putting the flag on every single bag, of making it clear to everyone where the aid's coming from. And I can give you other examples if you're interested in other areas of the world where there was no food aid involved, and yet there was a huge increase in American approval ratings because of our aid program, nothing to do with food.
Let's go to Mr. Kinsinger.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'm limited to 5 minutes, so I'm going to cut you guys off at 5 minutes so that this is fair. I want to tag on to what Mr. Sherman was saying on that. Speaking very honestly, food aid, and the reason we do it is for national defense. It's for defense policy. And that's how I see it. I see, foreign aid there's compassionate reasons, of course, but it's all really in interest of furthering American goals. One of the concerns I have, and it was mentioned, so I don't want to keep re-hacking this to death, is not only will we lose the ability to put the American flag. I have a picture, by the way, here. This is what and you're very familiar with it being involved in. This is what food aid looks like. It says, from the American people, USAID. It makes it very clear that that is directly American product. If we subcontract this out, to a country that doesn't, as Mr. Sherman was saying, does not have these huge surpluses of agricultural goods, and in many cases we may actually be driving up the local commodity price for that local nation. And it comes out in the form of a voucher with no real obvious, anything. And even if we do come around and say, okay, well, we're going to have a way to put an American flag on this so that they know, do we really want an American flag on commodities not grown in the United States with a different kind of maybe grain that's not up to an American standard? And I think there's also a huge point of pride from an American perspective in terms of this was grown here and now we are feeding you with it. And so I just want to, I'll give you another chance, and I'm going to keep you guys very short on that because, again, I want this to be fair back and forth. But I think we are losing, and it's a concern I have, and I'm not fully decided on where to go on this, but I think we are losing a very impactful thing that we do, which is put right in front of the people of Afghanistan or Darfur or wherever, that this is a gift grown in and from the American people. So I'll give you another 15 to 20 seconds to address that if you want.
Congressman, if you could put up that picture of the food voucher.
Yeah.
It says on it, U.S. aid from the American people, or on the right side.
Yeah, but it's not quite the same as a bag with
food. Make it a little bit bigger, but the point is it's there. And many of those bags are actually don't get in the hands of the people at the retail level who get the food. They get it in cans or in bags that they bring themselves. So they may never even see the bag. It depends. It depends on the circumstance. The other thing is the NGOs that have trucks or vehicles bought with U.S. government money, which is very often in these emergencies, has to have a thing on it that says U.S. aid from the American people. Everything has to be branded. In fact, some people are getting tired of the level of branding because we're everywhere. I mean, there are tens of thousands of these projects, in fact, hundreds of thousands of these projects all over the world, not including food aid, that has that branding campaign. It's very clear in these emergencies where it's coming from, even if the bag itself doesn't have it on it.
I'll just do this in 15
Sure.
seconds, Congressman. One is, my belief is a majority of food aid will continue to be in the form of commodities, just not statutorily required to have almost all of it, because I think when you go, I spent time in Tanzania and Mozambique, in Kenya and other places where it's just clear from the people on the ground, from AID and the World Food Program and others, that they need the flexibility to do both. But I don't see a day where we will not be giving food aid in the commodity form. I just think the majority. Second of all, you talk about national security. The main thing from national security is to build these economies up so that they become more stable. They get these people out of poverty so they can have an economic system that works, like in South Korea, where they used to depend almost entirely on food aid, and now they're one of our biggest customers. That's a big thing. And the third thing is just supply and demand. We just don't have the food to give anymore. It's not in the quantities that we used to have. And that's going to continue. It will no longer...
Yeah, but you're saying, in one breath you're saying, boy, if we cut this off, it's less than 1% of agricultural products. In another breath you're saying, boy, we just don't have the food to continue to do this. Well, those two are competing goals.
Not necessarily, because one of the foundations behind the food aid program was huge surpluses in the 50s and 60s. We had them even when I was secretary, because we had low prices and high quantities of grain. I still think it's in our interest to provide food assistance traditional food assistance during many humanitarian disasters. Cash does not work everywhere. But we've tied our hands right now.
Thank you. And I just want to add, and then I'll be done, in terms of the situation in Syria, and I know this is a little off topic, but I think that delay and everything there is a result of an administration that really doesn't know where it's going in the Middle East and frankly doesn't know where it's going in foreign policy. And it's sad, but I think that's a result of what we've seen there. But with that, I thank you, gentlemen, and I yield back to the chairman.
We'll go to Jerry Connolly of Virginia.
Gee, I was agreeing with my colleague from Illinois in some of his skeptical questioning until that very last editorial comment, and now I find myself on the opposite side. But welcome, both of you, and thank you so much for your service. I guess I have two concerns. I completely agree that we need more flexibility. I completely agree that in some circumstances, with the best of intentions, massive commodities flooding a market actually depress local production, depress local prices, and can have the opposite. I mean, they might feed people in the short run, but have the opposite effect in terms of long-term self-sustainability. And so we don't want to be doing that, and if we can make it better, we certainly want to do that. But Mr. Natsios, I have two sets of concerns, and I ask you, Secretary Glickman, to address them as well. I was a staffer in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee who helped write the last foreign aid bill to become law. That was 1986. It's been 27 years since we passed a foreign aid authorization bill. There's a reason for it. The coalition up here, after the Cold War, has fractured. It is extremely fragile. It is extremely difficult to find people to be enthusiastic about a bilateral foreign aid program of any kind. And anything that peels off support is a risk. And while we may look in an ideal world at what is the perfect public policy, and this may very well be it when it comes to food aid, I am concerned about the downsides. And who do we replace those lost supporters with up here? And I wonder, having run the aid program, Mr. Natsios, whether you might reflect a little bit on that, because you certainly had to do with that. And the second concern, I'll just put both of them on the table, over and above the political consequences, you talked about the problems of managing large bulk commodities, correctly so. Logistics are tough, theft is rampant, spoilage is a problem, ships sink, pirates still, it's like we're talking about the 18th century, but pirates still, capture ships and so forth. But what you didn't address, and I want you to, now let's look at the downsides of cash. Mr. Kinzinger talked correctly, I think, about there is an opportunity cost for the American taxpayer in terms of people not knowing, other than the central banker, that the taxpayers of America have helped. And then there's the issue of theft. I mean, commodities, take a little work if you're going to steal them. Cash is pretty easy. And we do know that with the best of intentions again, cash transfers are not corruption-free. So I wonder if you could address the downsides of those two aspects of what we're talking about here, understanding it's in the context of general support for improving a public policy.
And can we both get... Absolutely.
Mr. Glickman, in fact, if you want to go first, Secretary Glickman. You actually have protocol. You go first.
Well, no. I have more hair, but...
You are a full cabinet secretary.
Not much. The politics worries me a little bit. I'll be honest with you. I've been up here. I know what life is like, and I know the difficulties of it. But I would say nobody is talking about going to a cash-only system. Nobody. Not the White House, that they have a 55% minimum on commodities. Not the chairman, I think his is even the flexibility would print a larger amount of commodities. I would not support going to a cash-only system. I don't care what country does it. I think that's a mistake. We have to have the right to move this thing around. Somebody has to make some judgment calls. What we have now is we prevent judgment from being made as to what the wise thing to do is on a country-by-country basis, and Mr. Natsios talked about that. So from the political side of it, yeah, I worry a little bit about that this might fray the coalition a bit. But I would hope that we would be looking at the long-term national security interests of the United States in terms of having stronger developing nations that could be more politically stable and economically stable. But we're not going to a cash-only system.
I mean, we could do that, too.
Let me just mention, this is not cash to developing countries. We're giving cash to NGOs, and probably the best-run UN agency by far is the World Food Program, by far. And that's my experience over 23 years. And they have the highest level of accountability of any UN agency. When we give money to WFP, we're assured that it will be well spent. That is not true in all UN agencies. I don't want to get into other names, but WFP is very well run. The NGOs that do emergency response, the International Rescue Committee, CARE, Catholic Relief Service, I'm going to forget some now, World Vision, the institution I work for, they have, with respect to their cash, actually higher levels of accountability than the food program, because food is, it's much easier to steal. Now, if you compare our food programs to those of many other countries, we have very high levels of accountability. I'm not arguing that. But it's not the commodity itself, whether it's cash or it is the institution through which the program is being run. And we have a highly developed emergency response system that actually works very well, and we don't have a lot of leakage in it, at least in the American part of it. Now, in terms of the politics of this, I've heard this argument before, and I at first worried about it. However, there's one little interesting fact. There are two other big emergency accounts. One is the Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance. That was my first job under President Bush 41, 23 or 4 years ago. I'm dating myself now. And that budget has steadily grown over 25 years. There have been no cuts in it. The refugee account, which is something like $800 or $900 million in state, until last year or the year before, had not sustained cuts either, even during the 1990s when there were big cuts in the development program of the U.S. government, massive cuts. Those two accounts were not cut. I think the reason that they didn't get cut is the Congress in both parties supports humanitarian assistance in emergency situations far more than they do development assistance. Senator Helms and Jesse Helms, when he was in the Senate, said, I would abolish all foreign aid except for disaster relief. Patrick Buchanan, not a big supporter of foreign aid. The first thing, when he ran for president in 1992, he said, abolish all foreign aid except for disaster relief. So even on the very conservative wing of the Republican Party, even the more isolationist wing, they support emergency response, disaster relief, because it's very popular in a bipartisan way in the Congress. That is the reason that the budgets have been sustained even during difficult times. And the final thing I would just emphasize is when President Bush proposed the reform, we said 25%. I would not support a requirement that we go to an entirely cash response. I don't think the political support for Food for Peace is going to decline because only half the budget goes to buy American food. I would support a maximum, personally, of 50%. We proposed 25%. When we were 75% would have to be purchased in the United States. We just want more flexibility in emergencies where a response through NGOs with cash and vouchers is a more appropriate way given the security situation and the economics of what we're facing.
The gentleman's time has expired. We'll go now to Mr. Perry from Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you very much, gentlemen, for being here. First of all, I agree with the Chairman that the current international food aid program suffers from gross inefficiencies and that we in Congress absolutely must strive to do better and be better stewards of the taxpayers' dollars. However, I'd like some clarification on the oversight of proposed local purchase programs, which are designed to be more cost-effective. And this question, I think, would be to Mr. Natsios. My concern is that food could be bought from a broker who could collect the commodity from various sources and not just from local area farmers. And so I wonder, how can we ensure that local purchase programs are actually locally and regionally grown programs, not just providing U.S. taxpayer funds to fuel our agricultural competitors?
Well, the areas in which there are emergency, because 80% of this food goes to civil wars, famines, disaster relief. These are not the most stable and prosperous countries in the world. Believe me, they are not our competitors. This is not going to Brazil or Argentina or middle-income countries. It's going to southern Sudan. It's going to Ethiopia, to Somalia, to Syria. They're not our competitors. But you're right in terms of the risk of middlemen taking the money. In the first year that the World Food Program ran the local purchase program in northern Uganda, that is exactly what happened. And they corrected the program. They corrected the problem. They cut out the middlemen and went directly themselves to the farmers. They did not use middlemen after they realized what was happening. So there is that risk if you don't run it properly. What the intention is for AID, and I've talked to some of the career officers, is to integrate this with our agriculture programs. If we have an agriculture program in Uganda and one in Ethiopia, for example, one of the most food insecure countries in the world, the idea would be to get the NGOs and the contractors that are doing the agriculture program to be integrated with our food local purchase program. We would tell them we want a system put in place so that if we're facing a multi-year emergency, which happens in these famines often, it's not just for a few months that you distribute food, we would get the agriculture development funding of AID as a way of producing more food for there to be local purchase. You integrate the two, which we've wanted to do for years, but we couldn't do it because we couldn't do the local purchase. But you're right, there is the risk. But the NGOs and the World Food Programme, I think, have done a very good job in seeing to it that those risks are alleviated through good programming.
Certainly we know that the recipients of the food aren't competitors, right? That's obvious, but it's where the food's coming from. Are you suggesting that the controls that are put in place, and you talked about Uganda in the past, so I'd be interested to know how that was handled, and if you're supporting a legislative fix, or if you would be supportive or you're advocating for flexibility within USAID or the other organizations involved to do it themselves, and then how would we monitor, how would we ensure oversight and accountability?
Well, believe me, I had to deal with the General Accounting Office and the Inspector General's Office and OMB. There are more levels of accountability in our government, frankly, on our aid programs than any, and I say this, and I've studied this, and I wrote a long article about it, than any country in the world. There is far more accountability in our aid program than any place in the United Nations or any other developed country that has an aid program. There's just layers and layers and layers of accountability.
If I can just interrupt, because I don't want my time to expire, but I think Americans are right to be skeptical, with all due respect, when we hear about the Food for Oil program and you talk about accountability. Now, that wasn't just simply the United States, but still, I think most Americans feel that millions, if not billions of dollars were lost and unaccounted for, and so I appreciate what you're talking about regarding accountability and oversight, but on some levels it seems to have been lacking.
But that wasn't an aid program. I'm saying the aid program of USAID and the State Department with respect to our 150 account. That was not a believe me, that was not a 150 account program. If it had been, that scandal would not have taken place.
Again, are you advocating for a legislative fix or for flexibility within the organization?
I think it would not be a bad idea, Mr. Chairman, to put language in your bill to say we would want you to integrate our local purchase of food aid with the agriculture program. We expect you to integrate them. That's number one. Number two, we would want some reporting on a regular basis on how the program is being run, and then ask the AID Inspector General to produce a report annually, which he'll do anyway. But putting in the law emphasizes it, it focuses on accountability, and it would, I don't think it would be a bad idea at all to require an evaluation that would go to the committee. So I think it's well taken. It should be put into the legislation.
I think it's a good idea, Mr. Natsios.
Thank you,
well
Mr.
taken. We go now to Karen Bass of California, ranking member of the Subcommittee on Africa, Global Health, Human Rights, and International Operations.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you very much for your efforts in having this hearing and also in raising this issue. I'm obviously working with the chairman on this piece of legislation, and so obviously I'm supportive of it. But I want to figure out how to address some of the concerns of the opposition, and you mentioned from years ago that this was an issue, and so I'm trying to get a sense of if the concerns that people are raising now are historical concerns, and what your ideas might be to address them. What might replace, for example, the resources that we use to purchase the commodities? How might we replace that on the U.S. side? You know, to me, the idea that we have an opportunity to feed between 2 and 4 million people, and some estimate as high as 10 million, and knowing what Feed the Future does, and your vision, Mr. Glickman, which I'm sure is shared by our other witness, the idea of sub-Saharan Africa one day being like South Korea, I think that's absolutely the model that we want to go for, which is increasing the capacity of countries to feed themselves and not be reliant on our food. So I know that there have been concerns about an opposition about the loss of business from the maritime industry. We talked a little bit about the cargo preference law, but I wanted to ask you how you might address the opposition. What do we need to do?
Well, you know, in terms of, I'm not as familiar with the maritime issue as Andrew is, but
Okay.
I think you may need some transition assistance. The administration, I think, has proposed something in this regard. I don't know what the right numbers should be. That's a political decision, but I think that that's not inappropriate to consider that, although I agree totally with what he said about the merits of, or demerits of, cargo preference in this area. I do worry about the total appropriations. I noticed that the House Appropriations committee has cut back on some of these accounts, and so I worry about if we don't appropriate the amount of money that's needed, it's going to impact these programs writ large, whether they're cash or commodities. But the other side of the coin is, my judgment is humanitarian needs are going to increase in the future, and you see this happening with droughts and extreme flood events, and so we're going to have greater and greater pressure on us to provide some stability to areas that are going to be suffering dramatically. And I think that's just part of the U.S. culture and our U.S. fabric to do that. So I think ultimately Congress will respond. And the second thing I point out is, I say this again, we're not talking about going cold turkey,
right,
all cash.
Right.
We wouldn't ever want to do that. We may want to do 100% commodities in certain parts of the world. But having been, I was at a place in Mozambique where they were having some issues. They were getting some food for progress, and they were getting some Title II aid, and they got some money through the U.S. to actually create something called Food for Progress, working with the World Food Program, where they were actually engaged in growing their commodities and selling them locally. We have a real opportunity here to combine humanitarian concerns with what I call appropriate development concerns. Realizing humanitarian efforts have to be key to this effort. That's the foundational basis. And creating economies that are largely rural-based. Sub-Saharan Africa is largely rural agriculture, women-owned. But they're poised for significant development. And it is us in America. And I'll tell you one quick anecdote. I was there, and I was in Tanzania, and I was meeting with some government officials, and they said to me, you know, you have three of the greatest people in the world in your country. And I said, who is that? And they said, it's Bill Clinton, Barack Obama, and George W. Bush.
Right.
And I said, I couldn't find 10 people in the United States that would say that. And I said, why? And they said,
right.
Well, Bill Clinton, because of his efforts, the Clinton Foundation, and everything he's done. Barack Obama, in part because he's carried on a lot of the Bush initiatives, plus, you know, his heritage. And George W. Bush was the greatest of all. And I said, why? And they said, because he really realized the significance and potential in Africa, particularly when it came to health, global health assistance, which you may have been responsible for. And I thought to myself, they like us here.
I have found that every place I've been as well.
Exactly
what you said.
We've got great potential here. It's part of our national security areas. And so I think what we're trying to recommend in this area, which you and the chairman have agreed on, is how can we make it better?
Right. Thank you.
I just might add that under President Bush, the budget for all aid, not just health, all aid to Africa went up 600% in that 8 years. It was a massive increase, and it was done deliberately. Colin Powell and I had a discussion when we started. President Bush endorsed it, and then there were 24 different initiatives.
And it's well appreciated and acknowledged.
Yes, it is.
Around the continent as I've traveled there.
Exactly. With respect to the maritime industry, let me just mention, I told you my personal opinion. I don't like cargo preference. I think the time has come to change it, but the proposal before you is much more accommodating than I would be. Okay? And there is a proposal under the compromise. The effect would be only 6 or 8 ships would be affected by the proposal, the way the compromise is written now, and there would be 240 to 320 mariners who would be affected, and they would be eligible for a kind of a subsidy that's in the legislation. I am not an expert on the actual provisions of the law, the proposal that President Obama has made, but AID's career staff has explained it to me, and they have tried to make provision for it. If I had been around, I might have not been so accommodating, but they're trying to deal with the objection of interest groups in terms of the more narrow focus.
You know, when I've talked to some of my colleagues who were concerned about the loss of jobs in their particular district, you know, one individual had a school for merchant marines, for example, and so they were concerned about that. And maybe it's a question of the transition, but some type of way, because I see this as a long-term issue, and so how are we addressing the concerns you know, of members now so that we could garner more support for it? So the 6 to 8 ships, you know, again, I think maybe we could look for ways.
I think we'd better go to Mr. Meadows of North Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank each of you for being here today. You know, it can be said, you know, when you're in the middle of a budget crunch that you shouldn't take the risk of looking at a program that works moderately well, even though it may not be optimal. And so obviously we're looking at this today in the middle of this budget crisis. Can each one of you share with me why you feel like that this should be a priority this year and why these reforms need to be made now versus at a later date? Mr. Glickman, or?
I just think that you can make reforms that are not disruptive. And I think the chairman has proposed an adequate and successful way of doing that so it doesn't create havoc in terms of how to administer the programs. And I think he's right in substantively trying to give more flexibility and efficiency to the way the monies are being spent. Based on my experience, I think that it's the right thing to do. We will help more people, and in the process, we will advance the long-term security interests of the United States. That's the best way I can tell you. And you've got the opportunity now, hopefully in the Farm Bill, to do it. You don't have a Farm Bill up all that frequently.
Mm-hmm. I would make two arguments. First is that the world is changing. Food prices have dramatically increased over the last 4 or 5 years. There are several governments that fell. The governments collapsed because of the price increases in the developing country. The Haitian prime minister resigned over price increases 3 years ago because of riots. There were food riots across the world when these price increases take place. So we know that the world is changing. The program isn't changing. We need to find ways of making the program more efficient given the shift in the market. And the shift in our own markets. It's much more expensive for us to buy food in the United States than it was before. The era of cheap food is over. Most economists would say that now, and I think that's true. The second thing I would say is when we first proposed something like this under President Bush 10 years ago, we were doing it for the first time. That is to say, no one had proposed this before anywhere in the United States with respect to the aid budget. We now have 10 years of experience because there was a $60 million pilot program that was in the appropriation bill for the Title II program. I think it was 4 years ago, 5 years ago. They went through that. USDA did all these experiments. They did all these reports. I read the reports to write the testimony. United Nations World Food Program, which, as I said, is the best-run UN agency by far, they have a lot of field reports on what mistakes they made early on, how they fixed those mistakes, and how the program is running now. So it's not as though this is new. Yeah. We have a lot of research now as to what works and what doesn't work and how to do this the right way.
Well, let's pick up there because I think that was a GAO report in 2008 that we looked at that being part of that Farm Bill. And so as we see that some 5 years ago, that pilot program that was a local regional pilot program, what would you both say are the two lessons learned from that, both pro and con, that we need to look at in terms of addressing this piece of legislation that's before us? I mean, what are the good points and the bad? Obviously, it wasn't totally successful, or this would be, we wouldn't be having this hearing. It would be a slam dunk. So,
well, I think interest groups would want the hearing held regardless of whether it was a slam dunk or not, because part of this debate is on the merits itself.
Sure.
Part of it is on how it affects the maritime industry and the shippers and,
Okay, but what would be the two cons, other than on the maritime issue? What would be the two cons in terms of the implementation is what I'm talking about,
exactly.
And the two pros?
I think there are two things we have to watch out for, and I've mentioned that in my testimony.
Right.
One is you have to have agricultural scientists and economists working on this, not just logistics people, who will see the effect on local markets. If you are in the middle of an emergency, and I'll give you an example. In 1992, we had the worst drought in 20th century in Africa, and 13 countries had a 90% crop loss in southern Africa. Massive crop loss. We intervened, I ran the program, so I remember it very well, with 2.2 million tons of U.S. food. Had that taken place now under this legislation, I would still ship U.S. food. Why? Because the price spikes that went on in southern Africa were drawing in food from all over the rest of Africa. We could not have gone to local or regional purchase under those circumstances because the crisis was too big.
I'm going to cut you off there and let Mr. Glickman, and I'll yield back.
One thing. I think nobody's mentioned the word nutrition. which has got to be a key part of this discussion, how to not only get quantities of food, but qualities of food. And these, some of these pilot programs have created they purchase locally, and they have allowed the ability to include food with higher nutrients being bought locally, and that's been a positive as well, which we don't get with just bulk commodities going over.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Okay. Dr. Ami Bera from California.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As I've often said, the best part of this committee is it is pretty nonpartisan. It is Democrats and Republicans working together to go towards a common goal. And yeah, the conversation taking place today is a great example of that. It doesn't take a fiscal crisis and it shouldn't take a fiscal crisis for us to look at programs and evaluate programs to make them more efficient and meet goals. And the goals of our food programs are to save lives, advance peace, advance diplomacy. So if we look at our Food for Peace program and affiliated programs, we should evaluate it amongst those metrics. How can we save the most lives? How can we be the most efficient? And I applaud both of our witnesses today for talking about that. When you talk about the supply chain, efficiency is going to come from shrinking the supply chain. And we've had Dr. Shah come talk about a shift in mission for USAID from just being a donor organization to a capacity building organization. My questions, and let me use an example that we've talked about in India. India is a country that grows an abundance of food, but up to 40% of that food is lost to waste. It's lost to lack of infrastructure to move that food. It's lost to lack of cold storage. And there's a great example of a USAID-funded program at my home institution where I'm faculty, the University of California, Davis, that is looking for low-cost ways to improve storage and going into countries in Africa, going into countries in South Asia to help them develop low-cost ways to store food, to develop cold storage. And I do think that's exactly where we should be going. Again, moving from countries that lack capacity, helping them build that capacity, moving them into self-sufficient countries, and then, as Mr. Glickman, you pointed out, once they get there, moving them into countries that are partners with us, that are able to consume. I'd ask both of you how, what you would advise this body as we want to move from just being a donor nation to being a capacity-building nation in our partner countries. Either one of you can take this.
Well, we are a capacity-building nation. We've done that. The question is how much we do. We used to have a program in AID of which we stopped because the quantitative measurement people insisted that we have to quantify the results of all programs. And I know that's popular in Congress, but my own view is there are lots of things you can't quantify. We do help countries write constitutions. How do you quantify technical assistance writing a constitution? The scholarship program of AID used to train people who are in critical institutions in the developing world. We did 20,000 scholarships a year for master's degrees, PhDs, and some undergraduate degrees at the height of the Cold War. It was our most successful program if you talk to the career people. We do 900 scholarships a year now. I think we should go back to the scholarship program, not just randomly giving out, but focus on a sector. If you go to rural Haiti and rural Dominican Republic, we had a scholarship program with my university, Texas A&M, over 20 years, actually, to train people with master's degree in the Ministry of Agriculture in the Dominican Republic. We did not do that in Haiti. Go to the two countries and see what the rural areas look like.
Would you suggest shifting some of our resources then to doing university-to-university exchanges?
Yes, absolutely. We should move back to that system, which, by the way, was very successful in India. A lot of those high-tech centers in India were actually built in the 1950s, 60s, and early 70s with a linkages program between American universities and Indian universities funded by AID.
Well, again, it's certainly something that we're talking about at UC Davis, which is obviously a major agricultural university.
Can I just say, I think this is what Administrator Shaw is attempting to do in Feed the Future initiative, which is to provide a holistic approach to dealing with issues like post-harvest loss, which you talked about, where we lose in many of these countries 40%, 50% of their production. And so it's not all just relying on U.S. aid when there's an emergency. Somehow we have to build up these systems so they're able to be self-sufficient in food. And so I think I think that in some of the countries that have been Feed the Future countries, you've seen some significant metrics in achieving the goals that you've talked about. I might mention one other thing which doesn't relate to this subject. The level of American commitment to agriculture research writ large is coming down. The rest of the world is going up. We face a catastrophe in the future if we don't fund and sustain adequate funding in both basic and applied research at our universities, land-grant schools, and others. They're the ones that are doing research here at home as well as around the world. And a lot of the work that they're no longer doing is either not being done at all, and especially as you deal with drought-resistant crops and the changing weather patterns, or else it's being done by universities in China and the rest of the world. And we're big losers if that continues.
Great.
We go now to Mr. Yoho from Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate your opening remarks. Reaching more with less, and I commend you guys for being here. Mr. Natsios, you said that you've been around for a long time with different policies under George Bush, and it's frustrating that the policies haven't been enacted and the reforms. What reforms would you recommend that should be implemented, and which ones and how? I mean, you've given a kind of a list of them, but just can you kind of just bullet point them and just say, I would do this, this, this?
Sure. First, I would phase out monetization to produce cash to run development programs through NGOs. That is a bad practice. I think we should simply move toward cash grants to the NGOs to do the same thing. We'll basically double the efficiency of the spending of that money if we did that. Number two, I think we should phase out the requirement that 50% of the food has to go on American ships. They can continue. There's a subsidy of some kind that they're talking about in the compromise and all of that. The third change is that we should allow, I think it should be no more than 50% of the Food for Peace budget, in the judgment of the Food for Peace Director and the Administrator of AID, can be used, doesn't have to be, can be used for local purchase of food aid. Some years you may want to use the whole 50%. Some years you may not want to use that much. It depends on the kind. If it's Syria and southern Sudan, you may want to use the whole 50%. If it's a more stable thing in a country that has security, for example, as Haiti or Indonesia, where there isn't the same circumstance, maybe the percentage would go down.
Okay.
But I think those three changes would have a profound effect on the flexibility and the efficiency of our program.
Mr. Glickman, do you have anything to add to that? Okay. My next question is, you mentioned that we were late to the table in helping other countries grow their own food. What policies would we need to reform to fix this and to create it to be more effective? You brought up Canada is doing a lot better job in Uganda or several of the other countries.
Yeah, let me say something controversial, and I always say something.
It's all right, we're in
outrageous
Congress,
at
don't worry about it.
Every hearing, okay? When Peter McPherson left AID, he was the aid administrator under Ronald Reagan, is one of the most revered aid administrator by the career staff and one of the most able. The budget for agriculture was $1.2 billion for agricultural development, not food aid. This has nothing to do with food aid. See, what we're talking about today in food aid is the emergency side. That's 10% of aid's budget. The other 90% goes for long-term development. Okay? So the long-term development program for agriculture was $1.2 billion. When I arrived in 2001, the budget for agricultural development was $250 million. And that's in 2001 dollars, which are not the same as 1985 dollars. Okay? So what happened? I'm quoting Norman Borlaug, who won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1970 for creating the Green Revolution in Asia. He probably saved 1 billion people's lives if you read his obituary. He also taught at my university, Texas A&M. He was one of my heroes, and he's a friend of mine. Okay? We wrote an article on this issue today for the Wall Street Journal 6 or 7 years ago. Dr. Borlaug gave a speech, and he said the environmental movement, the more radical, not the mainstream environmental, said fertilizer's bad, Pesticides bad, irrigation's bad. We should go back to basically organic agriculture. Now, it's easy for Americans to say that, but you cannot grow more food unless you put nitrogen back in the soil.
It's true.
What happened is the environmental groups, the more radical ones, went to Congress and said, AID is doing all this modern agriculture stuff. It's a bad idea. Cut the budget. And they did. I think many people realize in the environmental movement that that is a disaster. And they have changed their position. And I support President Obama's major initiative in foreign aid, the Feed the Future program, which is not a food aid program. It's an effort to grow more food through agricultural development.
Okay, Mr. Glickman, do you have anything to add to that?
No, the number of agriculture specialists within AID went down about the same precipitous level as the funding went down. And so I would just say that, to teach the man to fish has been the philosophy of the Feed the Future initiative, and hopefully with the adequate resources and with the research world involved with it, we can actually change their lives.
Okay. You mentioned also a list of acronyms and NGOs that provide food aid. Would it be wouldn't it be wise to eliminate some of these and streamline it to make it more efficient to get our food aid out? Because it's almost like you could pick up a can with all the alphabet letters in there, and any 4 letters would be an acronym for one of the agencies we have or programs. If there's some that you could recommend eliminating, I'm out of time here, if you could submit them in writing, both of you, just say if we could combine these and eliminate them or just streamline them, it would be a lot more efficient. And I appreciate your time, and I yield back my negative time.
Thank you, Mr. Yoho. We proceed to Mr. Lowenthal of California.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First, I want to compliment the Chair and also the Ranking Member Bass to support the development of local sustainable food concerns. But I still have some of the same concerns, and I need to be reassured. I think you've already said it, but I need to hear more about it that Mr. Perry raised, I think Mr. Meadow raised, about what mechanisms are really going to be proposed that ensure that the funds are used to purchase food locally. How will we monitor these brokers who will collect the commodities from various sources and not just local farmers? As you pointed out as before, if a broker country in Uganda or Nigeria is aggregating, let's say, imported Russian wheat or Brazilian soybeans, how will we know that? And even going further, we heard in this committee, the subcommittee on Europe, Eurasia, on the threat of China's unsafe consumables. We learned about the health risks of unsafe food produced in China. Are we going to be really sure that we're not going to be spending money on food that's cheaper from countries with very low food safety standards? How are we going to know that as we move in this direction that we're really not going to lower the standards I like the goal, I'm just not really yet feeling comfortable that we have in place the mechanisms.
Let me just reassure you, Congressman, there is a program now. It was started by the Congress. The International Affairs Committees, as opposed to the Agriculture Committees, have supported this idea for some time now. OMB got tired of proposing this reform every single year and getting it killed in the Congress through the Agriculture Committees. So what they did was they went to the appropriators in the International Affairs Foreign Ops Committees and said, would you consider a separate line item called the Local Purchase Cash Voucher Initiative? It's $375 million. It's been a very big success. It does exactly what you just mentioned. In other words, it does what this would allow Title II to be used for. So we already have 5 years of experience doing exactly the same thing. All the proposal is to extend this to Title II, to this particular account. So what you can do, and I'm not at AID anymore, or if I were AID administrator, I could send them to you tomorrow, but I'm sure if you asked AID, they would do it. We have evaluations and Inspector General reports of how that money was spent in that account. The oversight systems that are in place for that account will be used because it's the same office running both programs. It's a Food for Peace office that would be running both programs. They've already put in place those systems for the $375 million program that's existed for, I think it was passed in 2009 for the first year, maybe 2000, I think it was 2009. So we already have it in place. It's simply a matter of extending the authority to use the same systems that are already in place for Title II.
You know, Mr. Kinzinger made a point that I think it's worthwhile repeating right now, and your concerns are well-founded. But, you know, this is a national security interest issue for the United States. How we deal with humanitarian disasters and how we stabilize the economies in the developing world. 1/3 of all members of the United Nations are in Africa alone. They're about 30% actually. I mean, this is a big, powerful political force. And by and large, we have to look at our American relationships with that part of the world in a strategic way as well. In my judgment, we can be more helpful. It's in our interest, and it's better for economies of both the United States and the rest of the world if we give more flexibility to these accounts. It's a part of our national security interest as well. And we're not talking about a revolution here. I repeat that. This is what I call a necessary incremental step to give more flexibility to people on the ground.
Thank you, and I yield back my time.
Thank you very much, and I now yield to myself. And I'd like to thank both of you for being here today. The Aspen Institute makes such a difference. And Mr. Natsios, I've just gotten back from Afghanistan, and I'm always impressed to see throughout the country, in front of schools, clinics, roads, there'll be signs, and it has the clasped hands with a U.S. flag and an Afghan flag. And what is impressive to me is that those signs are very rusty. And so if the people didn't appreciate the USAID projects, they know how to take the sign down. So I just say, you know, it's just, and it's so sad to me that we hear people in that country don't appreciate what we're doing. No, to see the little girls going to school with the white scarves, the little guys going to school with baseball caps that I know are not indigenous to Afghanistan. There's so much good, and USAID has been in the forefront. So I want to congratulate you on helping set this up. Additionally, with Public Law 480, we stamped the U.S. flag and from the American people on the bag. I've seen the residual of that, and when I was in Darfur, it was heartwarming to see the shelters that were made, very primitive, but yet they were made out of the bags, and that was their home. But it just, as an American citizen, I felt very good about that. And then I also had the opportunity in Muzaffarabad, Pakistan, for earthquake relief to see the same, from the American people. It was very heartwarming. But under a cash-based program, how could we have a benefit of hearts and minds benefit, which is so important, trying to reverse, as you indicated in Indonesia, a negative view to positive? Because it seems like to me that it would be concerned by having foreign source commodities under a U.S. flag. There's a danger of reputation, safety, quality of the product. How can we see that wiring funds would be more benefit than what a program that works?
Well, Congressman, in some countries where there's a civil war going on in which we are taking sides, Iraq, Afghanistan, those signs are a target for our enemies. Al-Qaeda murdered the headmasters of 50 schools that we rebuilt in Afghanistan because they were USAID schools or U.S. government schools and because they had the logo on them. So they're also a target, unfortunately, in civil wars. And so some places we have to, for safety's sake, say don't use the logo and the flag, because if you do, you're going to get the people killed in the war if we're participants in some way in what's going on. The same thing happened in Iraq. Now, what we chose to do in both cases and several other countries is we found another way, without specifying a specific school, We did radio and TV ads, particularly radio ads, because almost all these countries, including Afghanistan, that's where people get most of their news. And we did spot radio ads. They're very inexpensive. They cost a couple of dollars to do them. And we talk about our program without putting a target on the building that can get the headmaster killed. And we did some surveys afterwards in the Palestinian areas, for example, in Gaza and West Bank, to see the difference after we did the ads. And we went from a 5% name recognition to 55% in a matter of 3 months using these ads. So we like the ads on the projects themselves, but in some cases, when it's a security risk to do it, an even more effective way is to do radio ads. And we've done that. And, you know, if we tell people the food aid program is being run through the U.S. government on a radio ad, which we've done sometimes in some places, then you have the option of an alternate way of getting the brand of the U.S., the American people out there, or acknowledging the American people. It doesn't have to be on the project itself, is what I'm saying.
Mr. Glickman.
Said before, a majority of this aid is going to continue to be in the form of commodities, not cash. Cash, just there may be some more cash in certain parts of the world because of flexibility. The other thing I would tell you is that one of the most successful foreign aid initiatives that I've ever seen is the Global Health Initiative that took place, and that was a multifaceted effort to try to immunize people, teach them about the prevention of disease, and U.S. got a huge amount of credit in that appropriately, and that one necessarily didn't have the flag and the bags on it, but it shows you can accomplish your objectives in a multitude of different ways.
Thank you very much. And we now proceed to Congressman Jeff Duncan of South Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You look good in the chair, by the way. We've already heard concerns over the practice of monetization of the commodities by the NGOs for the purpose of raising cash. So I'm not going to go there, but I am concerned about that. I think we have a responsibility to be good stewards of the American tax dollars, and I believe that the majority of Americans would agree with this type of foreign aid. Now, they may not agree with giving F-16s to Egypt or M1A1 tanks, but I think they agree with feeding the needy and starving, famine-stricken people of places like Darfur. However, I am concerned that we're considering taking a transparent, reliable, accountable, and highly efficient program that has worked for almost 60 years with strong bipartisan support and replacing it with a black box program that operates without congressional statutory limitations and without real accountability. So how is wiring cash to someone in a developing country a good idea instead of giving them wholesome, nutritious commodities grown by hardworking Americans? And is the risk of diverting cash-based assistance from its intended purpose greater than it would be for commodity food aid? And I'll ask Mr. Natsios that.
Well, first, Congressman, this is not a black ops program. We've been running the program for 5 years now with a $375 million appropriation for Congress. We already run the program. And it's not a black ops program. And it's not wiring money to people in developing countries. It's giving money to NGOs that are very responsible. The Catholic Church runs Catholic Relief Services. World Vision is run by the Evangelical Churches and Samaritan's Purse. I was just in South Carolina, as a matter of fact, to speak to a retreat of Samaritan's Purse. They distribute some of these, they run some of these programs. And that's who would be getting the money, not black ops programs. And we don't.
Well, I said black box, but that's fine. Let me ask you this: we already see that NGOs have taken this food and sold it for cash purposes, and I'm not saying they don't use that cash for good intentions. That's absolutely not what I'm saying. Samaritan's Purse and other groups like that do tremendous work. But I think we need to make sure that as good stewards of American tax dollars that the NGOs are doing with the money what they're supposed to do, or doing with the food what they're supposed to be doing with it. And we also need to make sure that this money doesn't find its way to the hands of the dictators around the world that have been notorious for lining their own pockets with U.S. foreign aid. That's documented. And so I would just ask, what sort of accountability measures are in place to make sure that these NGOs, which I believe a lot more NGOs will be created should we convert this to a cash-only system, what mechanisms were in place to make sure that those dollars are accounted for?
Well, the first thing is, I'm not sure, Congressman, you were here when I mentioned this. I've actually done some research since I left AID. We have more levels of accountability on our aid program run by aid and state than any donor government. And it's not just the Inspector General of AID. It's the OMB has a whole set of accountability systems separate from the Inspector General. And then there is the General Accounting Office. General Accounting Office on the food program has done more research than probably any institution in the United States on this, a whole series of reports. So there is already very high levels of accountability on this program. That same level of accountability would be applied to this as it is now, because it's easy. I have to tell you, I've watched food aid get stolen before. Food aid can get stolen and it can get abused, and it has been before in emergencies. I can give you specific examples. I don't want to embarrass any institutions here now, but there have been scandals over food aid being misused. So if you think food aid somehow is immune from abuse, but a cash grant to an NGO can be misused, I'm going to just tell it from my personal experience, there is risk in both circumstances. And the way you avoid that risk is put very strong accountability systems in place, which I have to say, Administrator Shaw, I don't agree with some of the things he's done, but he has put a whole bunch of new systems in place. The money is being tracked, but you know, we're in very risky circumstances. If you're in Somalia where there is no government, there is no functioning government, so there hasn't been for 20 years, and Al-Qaeda is everywhere in Somalia. And they don't like us. I don't have to tell you that.
Well, I just reclaim my time because I'm almost out, but we just want to make sure that as stewards of taxpayer dollars that it doesn't fall in the hands of Al-Qaeda, it doesn't fall in the hands of road dictators, Joseph Kony, or anyone else. I understand you mentioned Southern Sudan and buying food in Uganda. Uganda has its own issues, and so you know, I want to try to support American jobs, American farmers, American agriculture, American commodities, American maritime. I like the American bag on the product that's delivered. All those are good things. They're good, I guess, ambassadorship type things for America. But graft and corruption does take place. And the chairman just got back from Afghanistan. You know, I went over there and investigated the fuel theft and graft that was going on in Afghanistan, the hospital plus-ups and American dollars being spent at the hospital there in Kabul, the Afghan Kabul banking system money. So we need to make sure that the right accountability and checks and balances and transparency is in place. And that's all I'm saying. As we move forward on this, we need to make sure that those systems are in place, that American tax dollars aren't lining the pockets of dictators or going to fund terrorists that don't like us very much.
Just 2 seconds. I think your concerns are well-founded. I would point out that we're not talking about changing this from an all-commodity to an all-cash system. We already permit a little bit of cash. We want to give more flexibility for that, but it's still going to be largely commodity-driven, even under the changes that the chairman's proposed.
Yeah.
And
I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Duncan. You've done so well. As we proceed to Mr. Deutsch, you will now be presiding. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome to the new chairman. I appreciate, Mr. Chairman, that you're holding this hearing today, and I'd like to thank our distinguished witnesses for coming and for staying and for answering all these questions. As an outspoken supporter of U.S. foreign aid, I believe that providing food aid not only aids in the fight against global hunger, but also stabilizes critical regions of the world, in turn providing a low-cost opportunity to bolster our efforts to protect our national security as well. And like my friend, the chairman, I support American maritime and American agriculture and American jobs, and I also support American values. And the proposed food aid reform, I believe, strengthens our foreign policy by reducing costs, by maximizing efficiency, and most importantly, by ensuring that a minimum of 2 to 4 million more people will receive U.S. food aid. I understand that there's hesitancy among many of our colleagues to support change at this time, but it's good policy, and I support it. And I'd like to ask our witnesses, given that we've seen in our pilot program that we've seen the ability to increase the number of lives that we save. if you could address the concern that some of my colleagues have raised, that if we move forward with reform like this, the United States isn't going to get the credit, or may not get the credit that it deserves. Can you speak to that, please? Mr. Natsios first.
The branding campaign, the regulations for branding, we call it the branding campaign, U.S. aid from the American people, I put in place when I was aid administrator. And I did that because of the threat of al-Qaeda and the change of the world. We were facing a threat that was very psychological in many respects, and we wanted to show what we were doing. We did not have those regulations in place to the same degree before. We also used red, white, and blue. I know those regulations thoroughly. Everything we do, every NGO project, every contractor project has to be branded. And I don't mean just food bags. If you go into a project, you see the headquarters, if it's a school being built, if it's a health clinic, if it's commodities that are being distributed through the health system, not food, has to have the brand on it. So it is thorough and complete. I have to say the NGOs and were very upset when we put them in place. They said, we'll be targeted, we object to this, because they like to put their own brand on stuff, to be very frank with you. But everybody's accommodated themselves to it now. It is very difficult for people not to know, under the existing rules, that this comes from the American people. You don't have to have it in every single thing, but so if only half the bags have it on it, people will still know the United States is where the resources are coming from.
And if we, again, just consistent with the values that the chairman and Mrs. Bass and I and the other members of our committee all share, if we don't enact some reform here, will it impact America's ability to continue to be a leader in providing food assistance, particularly to the most vulnerable populations in the world? Secretary Glickman.
My answer is yes, but it has to be combined with the kind of reforms that Administrator Shaw is doing in the Feed the Future initiative and other things to build self-sufficiency, education, training, all sorts of other things, responsible research, all that stuff. But my experience is anecdotal, but I go back, I don't know if you were here, I was talking with government officials in Tanzania. They know how valuable America has been in a variety of areas, from agriculture to health to other places. They know the commitment we have made to the developing world from the Bush era to the present. And I think this augments that, enhances that, but it doesn't eliminate. I think people are afraid that we're going to absolutely close down the shop of providing commodities and only go to another way of doing business. That's not the case at all. We're going to keep as a foundation what we're doing, providing food assistance in humanitarian cases where needed. But we're going to give ourselves the flexibility to help build local purchasing, nutrition, other kinds of things that will build self-sufficiency.
Well, and what will the benefits, what benefits will inure to us if the perception globally is that the United States is modifying its program in a way to help address the needs of an additional 2 or 3 or 4 million people?
Well, let me just say, when we go out, the Food for Peace officers and the AID agricultural officers go out and work with the NGOs to buy the food locally, they're going to know they're Americans buying the food. Don't you think that'll make the farmers happy in terms of the United States? We keep thinking it's only the recipients, but the people who are going to buy the food from locally, they're going to be tied to the United States. They're going to see our aid program in a much more favorable light. So we should see this as a whole, not as just in terms of the beneficiary. The beneficiaries are not going to be just the people who are going to be eating, but the people who are going to be growing the food with assistance from the United States government. And that will help us across the world. The biggest example of our success story in terms of our aid program is the shift in public opinion polls in sub-Saharan Africa when President Bush increased aid by 600%. I mean, he was not popular in some areas of the world. I don't need to tell you that. I'm a Republican, okay, to say that. I know that. In sub-Saharan Africa, he had 70, 80, 90% approval ratings. He is when he visited Ghana, when they opened that big road up, he was treated as a conquering hero when he came. This is after he left office. So why is that? Because the African people know what we did. And the United States is popular because our aid program, in my view, is the best image of the United States we want to project around the world.
I appreciate that. And Mr. Chairman, I don't know if Secretary Glickman wanted additional time. Okay, I appreciate it, and yield back. Thank
All
you.
right. Well, I thank the gentleman from Florida. In closing, let me just make a quick observation here, and that is that one of the more confounding arguments against reform is that moving toward a more flexible, efficient, effective system will make it vulnerable to cuts. That's kind of a conundrum to hear that argument, but in the current budgetary environment, I believe the opposite is true. Why should the Congress, why should the American people continue to provide up to $2 billion to support a program that is anything less than stellar if we can make it stellar? We can do better, and we must do better, and we have before us a bipartisan proposal that will enable us to reach more people in less time at less expense. That's the point. We can save lives and reduce the deficit. How can you argue with that? So I plan to support reform, and I hope my colleagues will do the same, and we greatly appreciate the time and expertise of our two witnesses here today. Thank you for coming all the way, and
thank you for your leadership on this issue, Congressman.
Thank you, Mr. Natsios. Thank you, Mr. Glickman.